This is the Non-Tech Podcast, conversations about education, technology, and culture, with Dr. Doug Reed and Dr. Matt Stranick. Thank you for joining us.
My name is Dr. Doug Reed, and I am located on Abagway, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
My name is Dr. Matthew Stranick, and I am located in Menakwisk in St. John, New Brunswick, which is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik Maliseet people.
This is what Camtasia is for. You just trim the first 5 seconds. So hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 47 of the Non-Tech Podcast. This is kind of a first, if you will, a historical moment, if you will, hence my AI-generated historical background, which I can get into. This is what AI, Bing AI, thinks that Seoul, South Korea, looked like in 1907. I don't know about these kind of tower structures back here, but anyway, playing history games with AI. So for its historical episode, in as much as this is our first sort of, I don't know if interview is the right word or if this is more of a panel, but joined here as ever, Dr. Doug Reed, and the, I guess, newly minted Dr. Lee Smith. And I thought really as soon as I sort of saw, Lee kind of reached out to me through Facebook just to kind of indicate that he was finishing up his program of study, that he had successfully defended his thesis. And I sort of conferred with Doug about it just to see if perhaps having an interview sort of format might be something we could try, since we are in year 1.5 of this endeavor, right? So honestly, that's more or less the thought. We've got some sort of Google Notes here, which I've got popped open in a browser tab, and then I also have your thesis, Lee, which you sent to me, just also popped in a browser tab. So we can refer to that as we go. But I guess just to start with, how are you guys doing? Doug, how's life these days?
I just finished the toughest month of the year for my job, so I'm looking forward to taking a couple of breaths.
Fantastic, good stuff. And Lee, you are in you're in Vietnam right now, right? You've been here. You've been there. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about where you are and how you're doing in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I'm in Hanoi, Vietnam, and normally a very beautiful tropical place with its own kind of gritty charm. Not so tropical today. We're in a little bit of a rainy, dreary patch, but it's a beautiful country. It's a city we love. We've been here for 2.5 years now. My wife, Deanna, who Matt, of course, knows well from working with her in Seoul. Deanna and I moved here because she got a job as the middle school, high school librarian at the United Nations International School here. And it's a really great job, and she's got incredible colleagues. And we love it here. It's going to be home for at least a few more years. So, yeah.
Awesome. That's really fantastic. And again, I guess just to kind of preface the whole background, which will surely, appear within the notes, but just for those just kind of checking in for the first time, it goes back to 2000, and you got to Mr. Jew's School, Heritage Institute of Language Arts, back in 2000. Was it 2006 or 2007 you guys arrived?
Yeah.
2006. That's right. Okay, and I was pretty sure you were there. Like we were there during the summer of '06, right? That's when we had we got campy. We were teaching at a hogwan. Okay, so for those who don't know, we are going into this sort of acquaintanceship between Lee and Deanna and myself. When Lee and Deanna arrived at Heritage Institute, I was about 5 months or 4 months into being a teacher. They got hired just a few months after I did. And there's a high turnover at these kind of places. Basically, for those who don't know about how it goes, Hagwon is like a private language institute, typically for kids elementary, middle school, and high school age. And these kids, while we were there, I mean, they would go to the Hagwon, to the English lesson 2 or 3 evenings a week, and then the other evenings would be like archery or I don't know, like high-end sports or more tutoring of various kinds. It seems like those kids really were being worked very hard, both in school and out, because that was kind of the nature of the deal. Teaching was completely new to me. I am safe to say I was a bit terrified, a bit hesitant in what I was doing. And so just having some experienced educators like Lee and Deanna arriving, who you'd been an educator for about 10 years or so at that point, had you not?
Yeah, that's right. We left Canada in '96. And I mean, for most of the time, we've been away. We've had a few spots back in Canada here and there, a year or two. But for most of the time, we've been out. So yeah, that was kind of beginning of year 11 for us. So yeah.
So there we go. And for me, just somebody who's kind of just coming into the education endeavor for the first time, I just really appreciated having experienced professional colleagues who I could bounce stuff off of and, actually sort of develop. And for me, that ended after, just about a year, a little bit more than a year, going into the B.Ed program and, subsequently from there. But when people are cool to you, I think it's just important to kind of remain in touch. And so due to the Zucker suck machine that we all kind of participate in, that's one benefit of it. And I just count myself really lucky to still be in this career, these many years later. And it's just been really cool watching Lee kind of step into the doctoral realm and kind of putting it out there. So that's kind of the long preamble. Doug, was there anything you wanted to kind of join in there with, Bud? Because you've done the overseas teaching thing a bit yourself, and you've been kind of doing the teaching gig for quite a while. So anything that's jumping out at you here, Bud?
Not really, no. Just interested to see what we can learn.
Well, absolutely. So that being said, I got to say, Lee, that I was really compelled by the title that you came up with for your research, Tears at the Heart of Things, Moral Distress Among Principals of Canadian Accredited Schools in China. I think that's just incredibly evocative and incredibly compelling in terms of, it makes me interested. So to put maybe the most obvious kind of question, what was it about that particular topic, and what kind of put you on the path towards the doctorate, even if we want to even just sort of step that far back?
Sure. I'll answer the question about the title first. And the very short preamble to that is I've long loved reading the classics. And, I had the good fortune of going to a high school where I took Latin for 3 years, and I took Latin in university. And so I've read some of these things in their original, translated as you're learning a new language, Latin. Anyway, so that's my preamble for this. So actually, this phrase, "Tears at the Heart of Things," this particular iteration of it comes from Seamus Heaney's translation of Virgil's poem, the Aeneid. And it's a breathtaking translation. The classics can be dry. This is anything but. Small digression, if you get a chance to read anything by Madeline Miller, who I'm convinced is one of the greatest living authors, she kind of reimagines classic texts from the point of view of a different character, not the main character. So there's that. Anyway, plug for Madeline Miller, who I would happily read every word, or have read every word of, but just incredible stuff. So Tears at the Heart of Things, though, comes from Seamus Heaney's translation of the Aeneid. And in that poem, Aeneas, the poem's protagonist, the epic poem's protagonist, he is moved to tears when he gazes upon a mural in a temple of scenes from the Trojan War, the war that had driven him from Troy, his homeland. So he was currently in exile, but he was gazing upon this temple and looking at these murals, these friezes in this temple. He saw people that he had actually known depicted in battles. And he came to an understanding that their sense of duty and obligation had cost many of them, quite literally, their humanity, their lives, but the essence of who they were. So this Tears at the Heart of Things is a translation of Sunt lacrimae rerum. There are tears at the heart of things. And it's not a cry of resignation or defeat. It's the moment that Aeneas recognizes that there's this kind of beautiful complexity of the human condition. There's always going to be strife and sadness. I think those are inevitable. He thought those were inevitable. But from within those moments come an understanding of self and of the world. And so to become aware was to become realized, to see things as they are, to see the world as it is. And there's safety and compassion and grace in that understanding. So when I was looking for a title, thinking of a title, this notion of moral distress is something that really gets at the heart of things. And so, I mean, I remember this phrase from reading this poem in Latin 30 years ago. And yeah, that's the long answer to the title.
That is so rad. I just, again, for those who are just encountering Dr. Smith for the first time, you have just experienced what I've known for the length of our acquaintanceship, is that he's a legit bibliophile, a lover of books, much even more so than me. And I kind of put myself, I did the English major and all that, and I still kind of envision myself as, being a reader and lover of literature and, a bit of a writer, hobbyist guy. And just the fact that you are reaching all the way back with something so specific and vital from that history, your personal history, and within that literary paradigm is just really, it's awesome, is what I think. So that's rad. Doug, anything jumping out at you here with that, or?
I'm just wondering how you decided to do this particular piece of research. The title made a lot of sense to me, but I'm just wondering how that's where you ended up, how you ended up doing that.
Yeah. So there's a personal rationale, and that is, I spent a number of years after we worked in Korea with Matt, Deanna and I, we moved back to China. And, by training, I'm a teacher of literature and poetry. But I did kind of join the administrative dark side, and I became a curriculum coordinator, and then a vice principal, and then a principal. And we were working in Canadian accredited schools in China. So actually British Columbia schools. So these schools operate exactly as schools in Vancouver or Victoria do. All the compliance and regulatory pieces are the same. The curriculum's the same. The teachers must be accredited the same. Content is the same. It's just that they happen to be outside of Canada. So I became the principal of a large, at the time, I think it was the second largest of these BC offshore schools. At the time, there were 45 of them. And we had about 800 kids, just over 800 kids, 55 teachers in this grade 10 to 12 BC program. And I just had so much, it's so admirable to me what these students do. They're studying high school, which is a difficult time for teenagers anyway, in their second or third language, in a kind of a context, a system that they're unfamiliar with, because it's very different than what they've come up through in their Chinese middle schools. Anyway, so they come to this program, and it's a Canadian program in the middle of China. And I recount this in the dissertation, and but I had the good fortune one day in the spring to be escorted from my office by some members of China's Public Security Bureau. They came in and they just took me out of my office, and they took me to a building about an hour away from my office, and there was not any talking going on in the car. It was very quiet. Two very polite men, middle-aged men, wearing standard Chinese nondescript suits. They took me to this, they didn't identify who they were, but it was very clear. And the secretary said, "You need to go with them." So off I went. And they took me to this building, put me in a conference room. And over the course of a day, they impressed upon me that I had a choice to make. And the choice was, we could remove this textbook that we were using and had been using for a number of years, a required textbook in a required course for graduation in the BC, to get a BC diploma. There were 3 pictures in there that somebody now had tweaked on that they felt were problematic for Chinese harmony, security. And so my choice was, I could order those textbooks removed, or I would be removed. So I would be, I'd lose my job, I'd lose my visa, so I couldn't work there anymore. But also the school would be shuttered. The school would lose its license to operate. And so, I mean, these are high stakes. These are 800 kids and their families, and 55 teachers and their livelihoods. And I'm balancing that with my own very deeply held principles about and notions about freedom of expression and freedom to dissent and freedom to discover information and all of these things. So I was given a choice. Ultimately, I felt it was not a choice at all. So I acquiesced and I went back to school, and we were moved. I went into every grade 11 social studies classroom. We had 12 different sections at the time. Went to every section and stood in front of the classrooms and said, I'll be removing these textbooks. And it didn't sit well with me. And I didn't know the phrase moral distress at the time. And as I was processing it over a number of years, I knew I was frustrated. I knew I was angry about it. I knew that I settled on the term for myself, ethical consternation. I knew there was consternation involved. I knew it was about my sense of right and wrong. I knew it was about ethics, but I also knew I had no choice. And so when I got to the University of Alberta in 2019, to start my doctorate, I hit the supervisor lottery for one thing. My supervisor was incredible, and she had, the previous year, she had been commissioned by the Alberta Teachers Association, and she had introduced into education, taking it from healthcare, this notion of moral distress. And moral distress is a well-known concept in healthcare, in healthcare professionals. It's been known and studied for 40 years. But until Dr. Stelmach brought it very peripherally, I mean, she mentioned it in this ATA report she put together as its first introduction into the lexicon in education. And then, because of my work through her, she was my supervisor, I came to know the work. I started to do my own, put together my own literature review, and knew that this was what I felt. What was interesting back in 2014, when it was happening, was all of my colleagues, my peers, I guess, not my colleagues, my peers, the principals of all the other offshore schools, had all received the same mandate roughly at the same time: remove that book from their different local education authorities. And we're all in a chat group or we're in an email group together, and some of them were angry and outraged, and some of them, it was just it's just another day of doing what we do where we do it. And I believed, and still believe to this day, that those people were incredibly principled educators, strong school leaders. I had worked with a lot of them in the different conferences and workshops and knew them well, and believed them to be running their schools the way that they should be run, according to what BC would have us, how BC would have us run our schools. But their reactions, frankly, some of them, their indifference or their kind of insouciance sometimes, they're like throwing up their hands. It made me wonder why I was reacting the way I was and the way that they were. And so that was the impetus for this doctoral study. I wanted to understand how people made sense of morally distressing situations, because none of us clearly were doing it in the same way. I knew how I was, like, I literally lost sleep. This phrase, we lose sleep on things. I literally lost sleep. It affected my relationships with the host school administrators, because I felt not supported there. They, of course, couldn't offer support because they were following a line that they had no choice but to follow, either, regardless of what their personal feelings were. It wasn't even appropriate for me to ask them their personal feelings because it wouldn't have mattered. That's not how it works. It's not how it tends to work in China. So yeah, that's the long-winded version of how I got to this notion of moral distress.
Right on. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
I don't want to say that's fantastic, because it sounds like you arrived at that through a great deal of personal turmoil. And Doug and other people who are listening, I mean, just to kind of frame this, Lee is the kind of dude who has done like ultra marathon running events. I think it's safe to say. So this is a dude who like goes on 4-day, multiple 100K runs for enjoyment, I guess. And you're talking about somebody who is also a licensed tattoo artist, okay, who became licensed as a tattoo artist in Asia and practiced as a licensed tattoo artist in Asia while working as a teacher. So, I mean, I'm not saying this to just kind of throw out some interesting trivia, although I think it's interesting as hell. What I'm going to say is, like, for a person such as this to have such conundrums, I mean, I think I would personally be, throwing up in my throat a little bit if I'm on that car ride with the two, security agents. I'm not sure that I would carry myself, how I would handle that. So again, I think it's just really good for you for even getting through it. And then also, following up and making that kind of the basis of your thing, man. I think that's just really fascinating, honestly.
Well, I have the benefit now of years later, we're on, this will be 10 years this fall, of framing it in a way where I come across as cool and calm and collected. And that's certainly not how I was feeling at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I was disconcerted is mildly way to say it, or a diplomatic way to say it. I was not. I was terrified. I didn't know what was going to happen. I was worried for the school, yes, because I was professionally obligated to, but I was worried for myself. I was worried for my wife, who was working in the same school. She was the librarian of that Canadian school, and it all happened so fast. I didn't even get a chance to tell her that I was being whipped away from my office. And so, yeah, it wasn't as cool and calm and collected as I'm able to talk about it now. That's not how I felt inside.
Well, I mean, just the hours that have gone into thinking about it. So, and I think also, your experience as sort of entering the program and then having a sympathetic supervisor sort of, highlighting certain areas of potential academic interest for you. So, I mean, that's pretty much how I ended up upon my study of social presence in these online courses, because within my ed tech cohort at University of Calgary, the community of inquiry model was right there and being sustained by Randy Garrison, the one of the original, progenitors or whatnot of said framework. So I think that's a kind of a common way to sort of find your footing, your theoretical sort of framework and footing. Can I ask, I guess, what led you to the interview? I take it multiple single interview design carried out through Zoom? Is that sort of what happened?
Yeah. So maybe I'll also say that not only did I have, I think, the world's best doctoral supervisor, and I'm immensely grateful for her guidance over the 4 years that, from the time I entered the program until now. But my supervisory committee consisted of, the entire committee consisted of one of the members is the acting dean, I think, still, of the Faculty of Nursing in Alberta. And so she is, within healthcare literature, one of the experts on moral distress. And so I had her, I guess, guidance and encouragement of kind of the validity of this kind of research, taking this notion of moral distress and bringing it out. I also had, to get to your question, Matt, about my design, I also had Dr. Erica Goebel and my committee. The Dean of Nursing's name is Dr. Diane Kunik. But I also had Dr. Erica Goebel on my committee, and Erica is, well, she's the editor of a journal called Phenomenology in Practice. But she's truly, I would say, one of the, she's world renowned, I guess, for her understanding of phenomenology in practice. And I chose a phenomenological methodology, and slightly different from what her expertise is, but she was certainly knowledgeable enough to give me a lot of guidance on IPA. So interpretative phenomenological analysis was the methodology I chose. And its typical research design is semi-structured interviews. So that's my long way to get to your question. So I managed to speak to 15 principals from these Canadian accredited schools in China. They represented 3 provinces, BC, Alberta, and Ontario. Predominantly BC, but I had representation from the other 2 provinces as well. And the original plan was for me to travel to China and to sit with them and to talk through these interviews, semi-structured interviews, in person. But the world slammed shut when COVID started, right when I was getting ready to do this. So we switched to Zoom. I ended up speaking to each person twice, usually about 3 or 4 weeks apart between first and second interview. And I ended up with 37 hours of transcripts, which, I mean, principals can talk, teachers can talk, you guys know this. People are happy to talk about their experiences, and I'm so grateful that they did. Their insights were amazing. I ended up with 440 single-spaced pages of transcript. And then, I mean, just incredible. These are very, very knowledgeable, very experienced school leaders, not just in China. A lot of them had been school leaders in Canada as well. So they really understood what it meant to offer a curriculum, to administer a curriculum in its full expression in a place that sometimes had strictures or conditions that wouldn't allow them to do that. Censorship is the easiest one to talk about with China. And I mean, it was what impelled me, but that wasn't the only source of moral distress that these principals were talking about. a lot more of that came out through their it came out through the interviews as well. So the semi-structured interviews, I did it because it was part of IPA's kind of design. You know, the ability to be with people as they're making connections and wandering through, and in some cases, maybe I was asking guiding questions, and in other cases, I felt like I was very happily along for the ride as these people were understanding what they had been through now. And so for some of them, the first time talking it through, none of them had heard the term moral distress until I sent them the letter to participate in the study, because the term moral distress isn't in the lexicon of K-12 education or higher ed yet. It's not part of the discourse yet, and I think that it should be. And I think it's one of the contributions that my research will make, and it's bringing a concept from a place where it's well studied and well regarded and understood, and it's measured for, and it's mitigated by strategies that healthcare professionals put in for themselves, because they know it's truly an occupational risk. But that isn't the case in school leadership yet, or with teachers yet, or in higher ed yet. And I hold that it should be. So, yeah.
That is so rad. I've got, a few questions kind of bubbling up here, and I've also got the notes. But I guess just wondering, Doug, if you have any thoughts or, experiences or questions you might care to put forward here, pal?
The second question I had ready, you talk about moral distress not being part of the K-12 lexicon. What about moral fluidity? Because you mentioned that in your research, and I'm wondering if you could just talk to us about that, especially in the educational context and your experiences.
Yeah, so moral fluidity was so the way IPA, the way I conducted the study was I was able to generate 14, IPA calls them personal experiential themes, which I then grouped into group experiential themes. These were the constituent pieces of each principal's sense-making process of making meaning of their experiences. So I tried to parse their experiences. I did it across, I did each case individually, and then I looked to see what I could come to in group. And that's what IPA calls for. But as I was doing that, I was asking myself a lot of questions about, recognizing that that's what's happening is step one. But then, so what? What's the why or the how? And so I created a framework from this research, and I created a framework that I called moral fidelity. And moral fidelity is the way I phrased it. Moral fidelity is this in order to kind of assuage the moral distress they experience, the principals would orient themselves towards an obligation that they felt in that moment. So either to identify 4 parts of this moral fidelity framework that I made, 4 kind of parts, not quadrants, parts, I guess, 4 parts of their meaning making that were indicative of and faithful to kind of the central belief they held in a particular moment, in order to get themselves through the moral distress. So I identified an obligation to context, and that's the feelings that they had to their adopted home for China. So sometimes they would act in a way that they did, and at the front of the mind, the primacy of their moral drive or their moral understanding of their obligation was to context, to their adopted home. Sometimes it was to the tenets which underlie the curriculum that they deliver, and so I named that to curriculum. Sometimes it was to the physical terms of the contract, the employment contract that they had signed to contract. And sometimes it was to themselves and their own personal or professional growth. So I named that to self, and it killed me that I couldn't come up with a word that started with the letter C, because I had context and curriculum and contract and self. So I mean, I couldn't quite make it work, but so that was this framework of moral fidelity that I built based on their experiences. But then moral fluidity was this notion. I presented kind of an early iteration of my thinking at a conference, and somebody in the Zoom room asked me how they're moving through that. Is that them just kind of flip-flopping or just accepting or acquiescing? Is it kind of a moral relativism? And I really wanted to address that because that's not what came through their insights. It's not what came through my understanding of what these people were saying. What came through was that these were, again, deeply principled, PLE principled people leading their schools in as authentic a way as they could, with deep and constantly evolving intercultural awareness, which is required in a job like this. And it was far too flippant to say, well, they're just kind of doing what they need to do. That they were doing what they needed to do, I think, not by a default or in a pejorative way. They were doing this in a very sometimes active and explicit way in their own thinking, but sometimes less consciously. But I found that what the people were doing was shifting, was moving between these parts of this framework I created when they needed to. Sometimes they were even holding one or two parts simultaneously. That this isn't an either or proposition. So I settled on this notion of moral fluidity, and this moral fluidity allowed the principals it allowed them kind of an intellectual and an emotional or an affective nimbleness, a capacity to find within themselves that measure of moral consonance in their own professional identity that allowed them to do the job. When I was coming up with the name of it, and I added this in I called my dissertation The Thing. From the time I started writing it until the time it's done, I still refer to it as The Thing, capital T Thing. So if I say The Thing, that's why. So I did write this in The Thing, and there's a phrase in Chinese, kind of a 4-character idiom, and it's about the water dripping on the stone, and over time, the soft water will erode the hard stone. I think it's a common metaphor, not just in Chinese, but it's sometimes taken as a metaphor about perseverance and steadfastness. Just kind of keep at something until you get the change you want. I think it also can be presented and read, and I do see it this way sometimes, as a metaphor about erosion and change, which I also thought got kind of to the same notion of morality, because sometimes these principles felt, because of the morally distressing situations they were in, they sometimes felt floating, listless, unsupported, unmoored, because they weren't able to find a place to anchor their moral positionality, because it just wasn't allowed in the circumstances that they were in. And so for me, I guess this water metaphor made sense for those number of reasons, which is how I got to the term fluidity. I don't mean it in any, I never meant it and don't now, and I will defend strongly to anyone who says that this is just kind of people, shifting to where they need to be to do their job. It's much more nuanced than that, and I think at its heart, school leadership has this strong component of moral stewardship, of ethical leadership, and I think that moral fluidity, as I conceive it, is the way that these people are able to do what they do in the place they do it, but stay true to themselves in as much measure as they have to or can in a particular moment.
Man, I think the people that you have sort of been in touch with, I mean, while you were sort of speaking to, because I mean, Doug and I are both from technology and sort of curricular, I guess, backgrounds. We all start as teachers and then we turn into what we turn into, right? And I guess just in terms of sort of a complementary concept, I was thinking that what you've sort of described in terms of presenting this framework and sort of, I think that's a really awesome, thing to have come out of your doctorate with, but then especially just in terms of perhaps that enables your colleagues, your cohort to sort of help make sense of their own experience. And to that extent, I sort of see some affinity or complementariness with the ed tech sort of notion of metacognition, in as much as, thinking about thinking is an empowering experience, because then you have more control, you're taking more ownership over it. So by providing your colleagues an opportunity to kind of express their lived experiences through these interviews and to introduce them to, these conceptual tools to sort of help them consider, these aspects of their own experience in a more, in a kind of nuanced kind of way, in a way that recognizes that nuance. I just think that's really impressive, honestly, and super, super interesting.
Thank you. I was heartened, really heartened by how people. It's not just the 15 principals I talked to who I had given a definition of moral distress who started to say, "Whoa, okay, yeah, I get it." I have had a chance over the last couple of years to present at a few conferences, to academics, which is great because then I get kind of some academic shine on what this is and guidance and direction and but I've also had the opportunity to speak to practicing principals. I've spoken to groups of from different school districts in BC. I spoke to the British Columbia Principals and Vice Principals Association in their webinar series and talked about my research with them. And while I'm talking to people about moral distress and defining it, there's a lot of kind of there's a lot of knowing nods in the room, and I think that kind of naming it, recognizing that it's a phenomenon, is the first hurdle, and which is why I think. I mean, I'm thrilled that you guys would have me on here and would listen to me go on about this, because I think this knowledge mobilization, getting this notion out to practicing principals who aren't going to look up or find the literature that I read, or because they don't have the time, or why would they? They're not going to probably read this 270-page thing. They're not going to, but I wanted to be able to, again, to bring it into the discourse. I think it's important for school leaders to have this in their discourse. I joked with one of Dr. Stelmach's other grad students who's doing her doctoral work right now on wellness. and how wellness is conceptualized in, she's looking at superintendents, I think, in Alberta, but how wellness is conceptualized in school districts. And I've joked with her that I think moral distress needs the same kind of PR campaign that wellness has had over this last, however many, 10 years or 20 years. When I was a young teacher, we weren't talking explicitly about work-life balance and wellness in the same way that it is now. Of course, the terms existed, and of course, we were talking about things like that, but not using this language. But over the last 20 years, it's wellness and wellness and wellness in education, which is great. It should be. But I also think that moral distress needs that same kind of push. I believe it to be an occupational risk with school leaders, with teachers in their classrooms, in higher ed. When I was speaking to other people about my research, anyone who's kind enough to listen, I'll blab on to about this. But my dad is one of the people that I talked to in my pilot study was a principal in China at one of these BC offshore schools. And he got back to Canada and said, no, like I'll go back and I'll go back to a classroom. He just wasn't, he was compelled to move away from school leadership because of what he had experienced through morally distressing situations in school leadership. That's very not common. It's identified clearly with nurses in nursing that the Canadian Medical Association publishes flyers every year for medical professionals about moral distress and warning people about its dangers and the possibility that it could push people away from their profession. It can cause a depersonalization or a desensitization to that very kind of moral core of these kinds of professions. And I mean, that's the last thing we need, I think, is school leaders who are just inuring themselves or hardening themselves from these kinds of moral conversations. That's the exact opposite of what we need.
Man, that is such a thoughtful kind of way of bringing us towards the closing of this conversation. It's pretty crazy to me that we've come almost close to the hour here. I really, I'll just say that, from my experience, and perhaps Doug can relate from his time overseas in an educational role. I mean, from when I was in the Heritage Institute classrooms to when I was in Qatar working at the Canadian project, the College of North Atlantic's project over there. When I was involved, certainly just even at my level, going into the classroom, sort of finding my legs and sort of just navigating the cultural environment. Definitely, I had moments where, like, not only did I feel like I was hopeless at it, I felt like I was like a bad person for not knowing how to sort of optimally, manage my practice in these settings. And some of that was a function of being a new teacher in a lot of cases. But I think a lot of what you described surely will resonate. And I'm really glad that you've made that tie to the medical literature. I think maybe we need like a, Bell or Rogers campaign, moral distress, let's talk, or something like this, right? I guess I'll just kind of say, really, thanks for bringing this to our show, and thanks for just kind of giving us this really thoughtful, nuanced snapshot of what you've been up to. Doug, did you have anything else you wanted to ask or mention before we kind of wind things down here, bud?
Just one last little question. If you have an educator that is experiencing moral distressing situations, do you have any advice?
Yeah. I mean, that's the what next piece, right? And again, I think here we turn to, it's funny because I joked about the wellness and it being, we need to kind of ride that same kind of publicity train that they do. But a lot of what healthcare professionals talk about in terms of coping strategies, institutional coping strategies, and personal coping strategies aren't that different from this push towards work-life balance and talking to people who have experience in it. The first part of that, though, Doug, I think again is just the recognition. You have to be able to identify for yourself that what I'm feeling is probably this moral distress. Something is rubbing, doesn't sit well with me because of who I am, my own professional identity, healthcare professionals, I went to this incredible symposium, healthcare symposium at I think it's called the John Dossiter Center for Healthcare Ethics or something. It's at the University of Alberta. And they were talking in there, they said, if you're feeling moral distress, healthcare workers, nurses, well, just call a medical ethicist. And well, I don't think as school leaders or as teachers, we all have ready access to a medical ethicist. But I do think that, like in healthcare, we're usually all surrounded by people who have either gone through what we've gone through or are experiencing it. So I think if we can bring the notion of moral distress into the discourse and people can start to talk to one another about what it feels like, what it looks like, how have you navigated and made your way through it, I think the naming of it, the identification of it is that it's kind of the first step. Then the other things that healthcare workers are saying are things like, kind of better monitoring your work-life balance and exercising more and finding time, reflective time and journaling and these kind of things. It's not different than kind of a lot of now common wisdom about living our best lives. But I think it's the identification of what moral distress is, how it might manifest. I think that's the start.
Naming is key. You can't really speak to a point of getting better from something if you don't have the language even to describe your symptoms. So that conceptual framework, this terminology, I think that's I just like to congratulate you, Lee, on finishing your doctorate, at least the dissertation part of it, for your successful defense and for bringing this really, I think, important work, further along, which is ultimately the goal of this endeavor, right? And I really look forward to hearing what you're up to beyond. Can I just ask, though, just really, when do you anticipate that the thing will be available in some format? Are you planning on publishing it and kind of holding it back, or is it going to be available through the university in some way? What's the next step in terms of getting that into our hot little hands? Anybody who's interested?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say I really appreciate you guys. I mean, I've watched all the episodes of your podcast before, and I'm thankful. I have, and I'm thankful that there weren't any tech questions. I'm glad that we stuck to the non-tech part of it for me, because yes, great, because I understand usually about 30% of what you guys talk about. But in terms of the thing getting out there, the Alberta has finalized its formatting review now, and it's successfully resting in their dissertation database. It will go live in the week of my convocation in June. So in June, awesome. I'll be able to send it. The link goes live and it's public. I am looking to. I'm not in academia, but and I don't know what the future holds in that. I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So I am looking to publish some parts of it into academic journals. I'm looking. One thing is about the content, about moral distress. Another thing is about the methodology, bringing IPA into education, where it doesn't usually exist as a methodology either. So I'm going to focus on the methodological publications first in journals. But I do think that the thing was never written as a practical how-to guide for school leaders. But I think I would like to make something of it that, I don't know if it's going to be a pamphlet or a workshop or something that can come out of it for school leaders, because they're maybe not going to access the academic side of it, which is fine. These are busy people doing important work that they should be focusing on. But yeah, I'm going to try to get it out there in a number of ways, and I think it's important to do so.
Awesome. Well, that is really something I think we're all looking forward to. Come June, we'll be able to post that link live in just a few months. And I guess I just really like to say thanks a lot for being here. Doug, is there anything else you wanted to add, pal, before we sign off?
Yes, Dr. Smith, thank you very much. I don't know how fresh it is, so I know the more fresh it is, the more you like to hear doctor.
That's right. It's very fresh. So thank you. Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, from all three of us to whoever out there is listening, we appreciate you very much. And we're going to have some substantive WordPress notes once we get a few more resources in the Google Docs. So we're looking forward to sharing it with you via Spotify, Google, LinkedIn, and other ways across the whole wide internet. So thanks a lot, Dr. Smith. Thanks a lot, Dr. Doug. Take care, everybody, and bye for now.
Bye-bye.